Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to our show. We're going to begin by talking about Frederic Baraga, interesting missionary to the American Indians that has a very colorful life, eventually becomes a bishop. But let's talk about his beginnings, where he was born.
Well, we'll talk about his missionary work and his love of the Native Americans in a few moments, but he begins his life in Slovenia, born in 1797. His desire was to become a priest, and so at a young age enters seminary studies. He's ordained a priest in 1823. Now at that time, in where he was living, in Slovenia, the emperor was a believer in Jansenism. And this is, for our viewers, it's basically a heresy that believes that one does not have free will to accept or reject God. And we know that one of the hallmarks of our faith is that we have free will. It is left to us, the choices we make. We hopefully will follow God's will, but God gives us this great gift. I'm sure sometimes we wish that He hadn't, because sometimes it does have us make decisions that are contrary to how He would have us live our lives. But we believe, and the church at that time believed, that there was this free will. And so this was going in direct contrast to what Pope Innocent X had proclaimed in 1653. By trying to uproot this sense of Jansenism. We know that it comes back in the 18th century, again is condemned by Pope Pius VI, and Father Baraga, he is vehemently opposed to this then, but his bishop isn't. So we see that even in the church, you can't just say that because the Pope says this doesn't exist or we don't follow this, there's still going to be these differing views. Because of this difference between he and his bishop, of course, who's going to win? The bishop. He is assigned to a very remote parish in his diocese. And so that's what kind of starts him thinking there needs to be a different way of living out his ministry.
And of course, we know that in 1830, he learns through this Leopardine Foundation that there is a need for missionaries to go to North America. And so, and we've spoken about this many times in our series about the United States really being missionary territory. And so we see Father Baraga coming to North America, and he is welcomed by Bishop Fenwick, who at the time was Bishop of Cincinnati. But then Cincinnati was not only part of Ohio, but also encapsulated Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. And so there was a great need for priests to serve the small Catholic populations throughout this missionary territory. So we see that he does arrive, he sails to New York and then heads west to meet his new bishop. And even though he is assigned to this province of Cincinnati, his first assignment is miles away up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where he comes in contact with the Indians. And so this missionary work among the Indians really starts in Upper Michigan.
Absolutely. And one of the principal groups that he ministers to are the occasional fur traders and the miners that are part of that region. But his real ministry then develops into ministry to the Chippewa and Ottawa Indians. And so we see that need to spread the faith and to really evangelize these different congregations. And so we know that he does that. He established missions in Indian villages throughout this vast area. He travels from missions by foot, horseback, canoe, in whatever way he needs to reach these different remote populations. But what would happen in the winter is he could only travel by snowshoe. But we know that it says that he did this. He would not allow the elements or the climate or whatever it was to keep him from ministering to God's people. And what's very interesting is he leaves Slovenia because he is just cast out to this remote area. He falls in love with these remote areas in his early ministry here in the United States. The difference was he really did feel like he was doing God's work. where in Slovenia his bishop is kind of limiting his work, and he really doesn't even support the beliefs of his own bishop. Here, it's a reminder to us that it's not about where you're assigned or where you live, but it's about that ministry, and he embraces that ministry wholeheartedly.
And we see that Father Baraga really becomes a man of the wilderness. You know, he's with his people, he sleeps in forests and outdoors, and then he writes, he said, "A man may travel 4 or 5 days in this extensive and thinly settled country before coming to another Indian settlement." And so, you know, there's this whole sense that this truly is a missionary vast territory with small populations here and there, and in between there's absolutely nothing but wilderness. Eventually, we know that Father Baraga is named bishop. He's actually the first bishop of Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan in 1853, and eventually the diocese was relocated to Marquette in 1866 because of its more central location. But we know that Father Baraga, now Bishop Baraga, not only writes and speaks Slovenian, but also is fluent in other languages. And this helps him in his career to share the faith. And so how does that continue to progress?
Well, as you said, not only his native Slovenian, but he knows French, German, English, and then during his time here, he becomes fluent in the Chippewa language. And what's most striking is that after he becomes a bishop, he writes his first pastoral letter in Chippewa, rather than in English or in any of the other languages. So he really is setting the tone that while he is the bishop of this territory, he recognizes that within his diocese, this new diocese, there are many Native Americans, there are predominantly Chippewa, who need to see in him this great champion, who need to see that he will be for them. He develops prayer books in their language. He also makes sure that they are in Slovenian, that they are in English. Obviously, part of where he was sent was because there were Slovenian populations as well, and he could minister them. So we really see that he develops an understanding of all different needs and all different topics, and really becomes a bishop for his people.
We also know that in 1866 he attends the Council of Baltimore, and while there he unfortunately suffers a stroke. He's asked the priest who accompanied him to take him back to the wilderness of his diocese where he could die. And he eventually lives another 16 months, and he dies in 1868. So there's this whole sense of going back to his roots, going back where he started, where his ministry really was burgeoning and growing and flourishing. And because of Bishop Baraga, many people have received the faith, and today that faith continues to be grown and flourished throughout that whole area. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book called Saints of the USA by Brother Marco Buccarelli. This book, for children ages 6 and up, will fascinate young readers as they learn more about the saints of North America. Those who read it will meet 10 figures who have lived lives of holiness, as well as the Immaculate Conception of Mary, patroness of the United States. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these saints of our time.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino.
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 Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Simon Broutet. Finds his beginnings in France, and yet finds his destiny here in the United States. So let's begin by sharing with the folks that are with us a little bit about his early life.
We know that he is born in Rennes, France in 1779. As he matured and as he grew, he was being educated for a medical profession. This was the hope of his family. This was what he was being trained for. But however, along the way, he himself decides he would rather be a priest. And so we know that he does follow those pursuits. He's ordained in 1808, and 2 years later, he comes to the United States. He became a seminary professor at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore for most of his life, until his appointment to the wilderness in Indiana when he was the age of 50. And so we do see that most of his early priesthood, well into his middle age, is as a professor. And so just the contrast of that, a professor at a major seminary in Baltimore, Maryland, versus being given this assignment out in the wilderness in Indiana, is quite a change for him.
The other interesting thing is that every Catholic bishop in the United States, except for one, was born in France. And so that we see that the immigrant population of French, because of fleeing because of the French Revolution, coming here and beginning, because of Catholicity, beginning the Catholic faith here in our country. We know that Vincennes was the first diocese in Indiana, established in 1834, and its first 4 bishops were born in France. And then we see that Simon Broutet was appointed the first bishop. He continues his ministry as his appointment in this small diocese that is growing and enlarging. But then he has this wealth of knowledge and a background that he brings. We also know that he is a great collector of books. Why would that be, and how many books would the bishop have had?
Well, certainly from his time as a professor, he would have garnered a great collection of academic works, theology, ecclesiology, biblical studies, all of the different disciplines. And there would have also been literature, wanting to know different things about the country in which he now lives. So it would have been a vast collection. As a matter of fact, we're told that it was one of the largest collection of books in the United States at that time. And when he left Baltimore and moved to his new diocese, we are told that he transported no less than 5,000 volumes, and that he added them to the library of another bishop at the time, Bishop Benedict Flaget, and that this ends up being the largest library this side of the Allegheny Mountains. And so he certainly is a person of great knowledge, but wants to impart that knowledge to people.
And then as he begins serving in this new diocese, obviously his need was to build it up. And so he has some personnel problems, some money issues. And so he basically travels back to France in order to garnish some money and also to get some help in recruiting some men to be part of the diocese. And so he does have a young priest who comes and joins him and works among the Indian population. But while he's in France, he works with seminarians at this newly formed congregation of the Holy Cross. And there he meets with seminarians and who basically join this charism and this apostolic zeal that he started in this new diocese. And then as he recruits these families to be part of his diocese, we do see that the Indians and the white families come together to create this wonderful diocese that continues to flourish.
And we know that when you talk about these different men that he gathered together and sought to minister in this new congregation, one of those seminarians, his name was Edward Sorin, and what happens is he is filled with this desire to continue to serve. And after his ordination, Father Sorin leads a group of Holy Cross brothers into Indiana, and where they found Notre Dame University in 1842. Now, by that time, unfortunately, Bishop Broutet is deceased, but it's just another interesting connection to how one man's desire to minister to the people of God in a certain region took him back to France, founds another congregation, they come back to the United States, and from that interaction, we have an institution like Notre Dame.
And what's also interesting is that he engages other men and other priests to join him in his work. And really, isn't that the call of the missions? To not only to share faith, but hopefully to plant seeds in young minds and hearts to take on and to continue sharing the faith and ministering to God's people. And we see that Bishop Broutet certainly did that in his travels back and forth to France and to the United States. And we discover that at one time he also established a group of sisters to help in his apostolate. And he met with the Sisters of Providence, who traveled to Indiana under the leadership of a Mother Theodore Guerin, who's been canonized as Saint Theodora. And eventually Bishop Broutet does die on June 26th in 1839, after only 5 years as the first bishop of Vincennes. But he also began this new diocese and invited others into the fold. Let's just try to close this particular segment with a few notes on missionary work and how important that work is.
Well, I think as we live in our current age, none of us may be called to that traditional sense of missionary work, to leave our home, to leave our employment, and to go abroad. But on another level, we're all called to that missionary work, because if we look at the definition of a missionary, it is that willingness to move outside of ourselves, to minister to people who perhaps have never heard the Word of God, or in our current society have not heard the loving Word of God. And I think we are called in this time and age, much like Simon Broutet, much like Saint Theodora, who accompanied him on that journey, much like all of the people we've talked about, to bring that loving Word of God into other people's lives.
Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. The book focuses on her parents' journey towards sanctity in their family life and social commitments. This book was compiled for couple and group sharing and is meant to strengthen the journey of all in marriage and family life towards sanctity and holiness. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these witnesses of our time.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. We got telephone calls the first day thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to talk now about Demetrius Gallitzin. Really a kind of a storied life, a very interesting life, a missionary as well, and someone who has an interesting background that really sets the stage for how he is received here in the United States and continues his studies and his mission and his work as a priest.
Well, we know that he was born in 1770 in The Hague. His father was a Russian ambassador to Holland. His mother was part of a German noble family at the time. Her father was serving as a field marshal in Frederic the Great's army. And so we know that there is great prestige and trappings of all that attached to his family. He is a Lithuanian prince, by the way. You know, in all of this, that is his role. So oftentimes we'll hear people talk about Prince Gallitzin. We know that he is raised for a military career and that he did become a very skilled horseman and swordsman. When he was 10, he was sent to Germany where he received his formal education, and there he learned to speak 3 languages. He played at least 3 musical instruments. However, his father scoffed at religion. And so while all of these other academic pursuits and military pursuits, linguistics and music and the arts, it would seem like a very well-rounded education for this young prince, he was raised in a pagan atmosphere. There was no training or knowledge or practice of the faith.
It's interesting because later on then, as his mother becomes ill, she has a desire to be anointed, to have a priest come to administer the sacraments of the last rites for her. And there's kind of like a desire for her to return to the roots of her Catholic faith. And so a priest does come and does minister the sacraments to her. She eventually does get better, and then she continues to pray for her family, especially her son, to also come back to the Catholic faith. And so there's this kind of comparison with Saint Monica and Saint Augustine and Demetrius Gallitzin and his mother, where the mother prays for the son to return to the faith after living this life of civility, perhaps debauchery. And so eventually we see that he continues his military career, but then at the age of 22, he decides that he is called for something else. And he decides then to go to the United States, and he assumes the name of Augustine Smith. So it's interesting, he changes he Americanizes his last name from Gallitzin to Smith, so he kind of eschews his royalty and his titles. And then he takes on the name of Augustine. Strangely enough, St. Monica's son, St. Augustine. And then once he arrives in the United States in 1792, then some interesting things happen.
Well, he arrives here because there is the thought, or there's the word out that they're looking to train soldiers in this new country. And so he seeks to be part of that. But once he gets here, he changes his mind about pursuing a military career in the United States, partly because of the influence of his travel companion at the time, coming from where he was to the United States, who was a Catholic priest. And so in discussion and dialogue with this travel companion, he feels called to the priesthood. We know that he offers his services at the time to Bishop John Carroll, the Bishop of Baltimore, and that bishop was very glad to have him. He invites him then to study at the new St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, and Bishop Carroll ordains him to the priesthood in March of 1795. Interestingly enough, he is only the second priest to be ordained on American soil here in the United States, and the first to be trained completely in their seminary studies here. There was one other gentleman, certainly we want to make sure that we note his name. It was Stephen Baden, and he was a missionary to Kentucky, but he was the first one to be ordained in the United States of all priests, but he studied and received his training in Europe.
And what's interesting is Father Smith, after ordination, goes into ministry and celebrates that, we see him almost taking on what his mother had done for him, encouraging them to come back to the faith and practice and live the faith. And so we see Father Smith doing much the same thing. This experience really encourages him to be part of this diocese in Baltimore, and he's asked by Bishop Carroll to transfer to there. He assigns him then to the frontiers of Pennsylvania. You know, when we think of the United States now, we would be hard-pressed to talk about anything in the lower 48 states as frontier. And yet he's called to serve the frontier in Pennsylvania. There for 41 years, traveling by horseback, he ministers to the Catholics throughout that area. And that area includes many dioceses that we know today. And what would some of those dioceses be?
Well, certainly the area that he ministered to would be areas very close to us. The Pittsburgh and Greensburg diocese, Altoona, Johnstown, Harrisburg, Erie. So a very large part of what is present-day Pennsylvania and those 6 or 7 dioceses in Pennsylvania itself.
And we also see that Father Augustine Smith eventually uses some of his own money to carry on his work and his missionary endeavors. And he started the town of Loretto as a Catholic establishment. And he really uses this town as kind of a base for himself and for Catholicism. He builds a log church in 1800s, doubles its size 8 years later, and finally replacing it with a larger church in 1818. And by the time of his death, the town of Loretto really includes 10 churches, 3 monasteries, and it serves about 5,000 Catholic families. And he still uses his money to build things. He builds an orphanage. He eventually continues to reach out to his flock. But then he turns to writing pamphlets about Catholicism, evangelization. And then eventually when the Diocese of Baltimore becomes an archdiocese in 1808, Loretto becomes part of the Diocese of Philadelphia. In closing, very briefly, let's mention something about the end of Father Gallitzin's life.
Well, we know that he becomes the Vicar General for Western Pennsylvania in 1823. He was asked to become the first bishop of Pittsburgh, but he refused. And did not want to come to this new diocese. And it actually does not become a diocese until 3 years after his death. At various times, he was asked to be bishops of different dioceses, such as Cincinnati, Detroit, Philadelphia, but each time he refused. He continued to call himself Father Augustine Smith until after his father's death, when he then assumed his own identity. And then in 1834, when he was 64 years old, he was thrown from his horse as he was ministering to people, was seriously injured his leg, and it was that injury that ultimately took his life.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.